Grandpa trying to play with the camera again. so what I want to get into today is we're going to the next part of Al-Fatiha, which is Ihdina As-Siraat Al-Mustaqeem, guide us to the straight path. Because the last couple times we met, we talked about Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. So Ihdina As-Siraat Al-Mustaqeem. So what we want to talk about today is about what exactly is As-Siraat Al-Mustaqeem. What exactly is the straight path? And we've actually talked about this in some of our other classes. I think we talked about it in a live class before. But we're going to go through it again because the as the Quran says, فَإِنَّ ذِكْرَ تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, the reminder benefits the believers. So, even though we might have went over certain things, but going over it again helps to lock it in. And I find too that going over things that we might have went over before, when you go over it again, you're not the same person you were when you went over it the first time. You've learned other things, you've had other experiences, so the information kind of hits different the second time, the third time, the fourth time. So how to answer this question, what is As-Siraat al-Mustaqeem, or what's translated as the straight path? So the first thing that I want to point out, and this is maybe one aspect that we didn't talk about, is the word mustaqim. Mustaqim. Okay, so let me see. I was doing this before, but how was I doing it? How was I messaging the chat? Why don't I have a message thing? Okay. I don't know why I don't see a message thing. I know I was doing that before.
On your panel at the bottom where you've got your bit to mute and unmute your mic, there should be like a little speech bubble. Just click that.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm looking for. That's where I was at before, but it's there. I don't see one.
Oh.
I don't know why. It's giving me the option to disconnect. It's giving me the microphone, share your screen, then other things I can connect to it, turn off camera. That's weird. I know I did that before. Okay, we ain't gonna worry about it because I don't want to hold the class up too much. But I'll play around with it later and see why that's doing that. But the word mustaqim, what I want to point out about mustaqim that I think is interesting is mustaqim is from the word qama, which means to stand. Okay, so that's the first thing. So the what we translate as straight, because in the phrase as-Siraat al-Mustaqeem, the straight path, the first word in that phrase is sirat, path. The second word is mustaqim, which is what we're translating as straight. Okay, and the reason that's like that for anyone who's not familiar with Arabic is because the adjective always comes after the noun. So an adjective is something that describes a noun, right? That's what an adjective is. So if you say, for example, red car, for example, in English. So red car in English, red is the adjective. It describes the noun car, right? But we put red, we put the adjective before the noun. But in Arabic, we would do it the other way around. We would say car, red. We put the adjective after, okay? So that's why here, As-Siraat al-Mustaqeem is literally the path straight, okay? So mustaqim is the word that we're translating as straight. So this word comes from qama, which means to stand, as I was saying. So even though we translate it as straight, I think we want to feel the deeper meaning of it, right? Because what does it mean for this word mustaqim to come from the word to stand, qama? That's also a word I think we've talked about before, what that means, right? So, and I'll mention some things about that in a second. But another thing about this word mustaqim is the beginning of it. How does it become mustaqim? Like, how does that way of phrasing it come about? So, if you remember when we talked about in some of our classes the increased forms of the verb, that means you add things to the beginning of the verb to enhance the meaning. So you always start with a three-letter verb, right? What we call the triliteral verb or the three-letter verb. And then you add things to it, which give it different shades of meaning. And that's what we call the increased forms. Al-fi'lu thulathi al-mazidu fi. The triliteral or three-letter verbs that have been increased. So this word mustaqim is from the increased forms of the verb. So if you remember in some of our classes, we talked about what it means when you put the alif sin ta on the beginning of a verb. Like if you have ghafara, for example, meaning to forgive, and you say istaghfara. So you put that like ista on the beginning of it. Istaghfara. That means to seek. So whenever you put that on there, that's what that means. It means to seek. So istaghfara means to seek forgiveness. Okay?
It's like shaitan is
Istakbar, to seek to become big. Right?
Right.
So mustaqim, right, is from that increased form. So as-Siraat al-Mustaqeem, how do we think about it then when the part of the meaning of it is to seek to stand? So that's a good question. I don't have one exact answer for it, but I just want to get you to think about it. One way maybe that we can think about it is it's a path that tends towards being upright. Meaning, so if you think of the idea of seeking being something that you're drawn to or pulls you in a certain direction, because that's what you're seeking. So As-Siraat al-Mustaqeem, perhaps one way to think about that is it's a path that always brings you towards being upright. The path itself is a path that seeks uprightness. It's always gonna seek to be upright, right? Maybe that's one way of thinking about it. But I just wanted to mention that as a point about the word itself, just to start thinking about some deeper meanings of it, because the idea of standing as a kind of a symbolic way of expressing uprightness, we find that in the Quran quite a few times. For example, Inna hadha al-Qur'ana yahdi lillati hiya aqwam. There's one verse that says, truly this Quran guides to that which is aqwam. So usually they translate that as this Quran guides to that which is most upright. They say upright, right? Because you're standing upright. But aqwam, literally from the word qama, means the most standing, right? That's why we say upright. Also in the Quran, he says about the Quran itself in chapter 18. I'm trying to remember the verse. The beginning of it's the first verse. Alhamdulillahi alladhi anzala al-kitaba, or is it anzala ala abdihi al-kitab? I think it's ala abdihi. Alhamdulillahi alladhi anzala ala abdihi al-kitaba wa lam yaj'al lahu iwaja. Let me make sure that's the right. Yep, that's it. He said, Alhamdulillahi alladhi anzala ala abdihi al-kitaba wa lam yaj'al lahu iwajan qayyiman. Right? So he said, all praise belongs to Allah who sent down upon his servant the book, وَلَمْ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ عِوَجًا, and he did not make any crookedness for it, قَيِّمًا. Then he described it as قَيِّمًا. It's something that stands upright. Okay? So part of the meaning of that then, if you look at this verse, something that is qayyim, something that stands upright, is something that doesn't have any crookedness. And that's maybe why they say when they translate As-Siraat al-Mustaqeem, they translate it as the straight path, right? Because of a verse like this, where he talks about the book and he says he didn't make any crookedness for it, but then he calls it qayyiman. It stands upright. Okay? So even though straight is not necessarily a wrong way to translate it, I'm not saying that, but I want you to see more of the depth of the meaning that has to do with standing. Because a lot of times when I hear the word straight to me has a kind of a horizontal component to it, or a horizontal feel to it. I'm going straight, right? But if you think of straight, not just horizontally, but vertically. So you can go straight up too. So upright has a vertical nature to it, right? So I like to think about As-Siraat Al-Mustaqeem like that too. Yes, it's straight, but it's straight in a vertical way. It's taking you upwards. So it's a path that's making you stand up without crookedness. So I think that's a beautiful way of thinking about it. Now, another thing too about this is I think the idea of As-Siraat Al-Mustaqeem, and this is the part that we probably have talked about before, is universal. So I think here when we say As-Siraat Al-Mustaqeem, we're asking to be guided to a universal path, right? That's a path of universal human values that was shared by all the prophets and messengers. It's not, in my opinion, Allah knows best, and we're going to go to the verses to show why I'm saying that. But in my opinion, I don't think it's just this narrow thing. I think sometimes people like to make it narrow for only their particular group. But I think As-Siraat Al-Mustaqeem, what we're asking is to be guided to this universal path that was a path of universal human values that was embraced and taught by all the prophets and messengers. So if we look in Surah Al-An'am, we find a couple interesting discussions in Surah Al-An'am. One of them I'm pretty sure we talked about before. One of them I don't think we did. So I want to share with you both of them. So starting from verse 151. So Surah Al-An'am is Surah 6, and we're going to start from verse 151. And I've mentioned these verses before in saying that perhaps this is what we can think of as like a Quranic version of the 10 Commandments. Because if you count these things, there's 10 things that are mentioned here, right? And at the end of each verse, he says, ذَلِكُمْ وَصَّاكُمْ بِهِ. That is what he commands you. But the word for command here is wasa, which is interestingly how they translate the 10 Commandments. They say al-wasaya al-ashr, the 10 wasaya, the 10 advices or commandments. And then what's interesting about this is right after these 10 things are mentioned, so this is going to be from verse 151 to 153, and then right when you go to 154, the mention of Musa comes about, which we know is the person that is credited with the 10 Commandments. So it's a really interesting connection. So starting from 151, it says, قُلْ تَعَالَوْا أَتْلُ مَا حَرَّمَ رَبُّكُمْ عَلَيْكُمْ. Say, come, I will recite what your Lord has forbidden upon you. Now, I want to point out something else too before we move on reading this. When he says, قُلْ تَعَالَوْا, right? Which we translate as say, come. We say ta'alaw means to come, right? But also, ta'alaw is from the root ala, which means to elevate or to be high. So there's a couple different meanings, I think, here, which is, yes, it means when you tell someone that, it means to come. Like if I'm going somewhere, I can tell someone, ta'al, come here, ta'al, right? But there's another meaning there, which is elevation. So perhaps another kind of subtle meaning that we're being given, which kind of goes back to the idea of Al-Mustaqeem, the uprightness, right? Is that we're saying, قُلْ تَعَالَوْا, but it's not coming to me horizontally, it's vertically. In other words, what I'm going to recite is on a higher level. You have to elevate to a higher level to truly implement and understand what I'm going to recite, right? And not on a higher level, like not saying that the person, not saying in an arrogant way, like the person is on a higher level, but saying these are higher level concepts. So if you want to grasp and apply these concepts, you have to elevate to a different level of consciousness. So he says, قُلْ تَعَالَوْا أَتْلُ مَا حَرَّمَ رَبُّكُمْ عَلَيْكُمْ. Say, elevate. That's how I like to think of ta'alaw. Elevate. Let's talk up here for a little while. I'll recite what your Lord has forbidden upon you. أَلَّا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا, that you do not associate anything with him. وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, and to do ihsan to the parents. وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُم مِّنْ إِمْلَاقٍ, and don't kill your children from poverty. نَحْنُ نَرْزُقُكُمْ وَإِيَّاهُمْ, we provide for them, we provide for you and them. وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الْفَوَاحِشَ مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَمَا بَطَنَ, that's 4. Don't approach al-fawahish, obscene, evil obscene things, what is apparent from them and what is hidden. وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا النَّفْسَ الَّتِي حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ, and do not kill a soul that Allah has forbidden except with right. That's 5. Then he says, ذَلِكُمْ وَصَّاكُمْ بِهِ, that he commands you with, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ, perhaps you may use your intellect. Then the next verse he says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا مَالَ الْيَتِيمِ إِلَّا بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ حَتَّى يَبْلُغَ أَشُدَّهُ, and do not approach the wealth of the orphan except with that which is most beautiful until he reaches his age of full strength. That's 6. وَأَوْفُوا الْكَيْلَ وَالْمِيزَانَ بِالْقِسْطِ, and fulfill the measuring and the weighing with justice. That's 7. لَا نُكَلِّفُ نَفْسًا إِلَّا وُسْعَهَا, we don't burden a soul more than it can bear. وَإِذَا قُلْتُمْ فَعْدِلُوا وَلَوْ كَانَ ذَا قُرْبَى, and when you speak, be just, even if it's someone who is near of kin. That's 8. وَبِعَهْدِ اللَّهِ أَوْفُوا, and fulfill the covenant of Allah. That's 9. ذَلِكُمْ وَصَّاكُمْ بِهِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ, that he commands you with so that you can remember. And then number 10, and this connects together with اهدنا الصراط المستقيم, وَأَنَّ هَذَا صِرَاطِي مُسْتَقِيمًا فَاتَّبِعُوا. Number 10, and this is my straight path, so follow it. This is my straight path.
What is the covenant of Allah?
Oh, that would be a whole different discussion. That's a good question.
I never heard of that before. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I think we would have to study that in detail to see, is it talking about something specific or is it saying in general? Whenever the covenant, fulfill the covenant of Allah, meaning whenever you make a covenant based on Allah or connected to the name of Allah or in the name of Allah, fulfill that. So is it saying in general, a covenant that you make like that is a covenant of Allah, right? Or is it specifically talking about something? That's something we would have to go to all the verses in the Quran that use the word covenant and see if there's any other verses and try to put that together. But that is a good question.
Okay, sorry.
No, you're good. And then he says, وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا السُّبُلَ فَتَفَرَّقَ بِكُمْ عَنْ سَبِيلِهِ, and don't follow the other paths because they will take you away from my path. ذَلِكُمْ وَصَّاكُمْ بِهِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, that he commands you with so that you may have taqwa. Then he said, ثُمَّ آتَيْنَا مُوسَى الْكِتَابِ, then we gave Musa the book. So it's an interesting correlation when you think about Musa having been given the 10 commandments, and then you look in these verses and you can see that there's 10 things here that are mentioned, and then Musa is mentioned right after. So the idea, though, is that the main idea to me is that here in 153, after he mentions these, what I would consider to be universal human values, right? You don't kill a person, you don't kill your children, you're dutiful to your parents, like these things that we could apply in pretty much any culture in any time. It's not specific to a particular culture or a particular time. And after that, he says, وَأَنَّ هَذَا صِرَاطِي مُسْتَقِيمًا, this is my straight path, right? So that's why I said when we think about As-Siraat al-Mustaqeem, As-Siraat al-Mustaqeem, I think is the path of universal human values that applies in any place, in any time, in any culture. It's not just restricted to place and time and culture. So also, though, in Surah Al-An'am, a place that we didn't talk about is, and I think that which supports this idea, and I think it's interesting because these are both in the same chapter. That's why I think it supports the idea that As-Siraat al-Mustaqeem is a path of universal human values. They're in the same chapter. So in 6:151 through 153, he goes into these 10 things and says at the end of that, or the 10th thing actually is, this is my straight path. But then look here in the same chapter, in verse, we'll start from 83 up to 89. No, up to 90. So 83 to 90. This is a really beautiful section. He mentions here 18 prophets and messengers, if I recall the number correctly. He says, وَتِلْكَ حُجَّتُنَا آتَيْنَاهَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ عَلَى قَوْمِهِ. And that is our argument, or our evidence that we gave to Ibrahim over his people. نَرْفَعُ دَرَجَاتٍ مَنْ نَشَاءُ إِنَّ رَبَّكَ حَكِيمٌ عَلِيمٌ. We raise levels whomsoever we will. Truly your Lord is wise and knowing. وَوَهَبْنَا لَهُ إِسْحَاقَ وَيَعْقُوبَ. And we gave to him Isaac and Jacob. كُلًّا هَدَيْنَا. All of them we guided. وَنُوحًا هَدَيْنَا مِنْ قَبْلِ. And Noah we guided before that. وَمِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِهِ دَاوُودَ وَسُلَيْمَانَ. And from his offspring is Dawood and Sulaiman, Solomon, Ayub or Job, وَيُوسُف وَمُوسَى وَهَارُونَ. And Joseph and Moses and Aaron. وَكَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ. And likewise do we recompense the good doers. وَزَكَرِيَّا وَيَحْيَا وَعِيسَى وَإِلْيَاسَ. Zechariah, John, Jesus, and Elias, كُلٌّ مِنَ الصَّالِحِينَ. All of them are from the righteous. وَإِسْمَاعِيلَ وَالْيَسَعَ وَيُونُسَ وَلُوطًا. And Ishmael and Al-Yasa and Jonah and Lot. وَكُلًّا فَضَّلْنَا عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ. And all of them we favored over all of the worlds. وَمِنْ آبَائِهِمْ وَذُرِّيَّاتِهِمْ وَإِخْوَانِهِمْ. And from their fathers and their offspring and their brothers. وَاجْتَبَيْنَاهُمْ وَهَدَيْنَاهُمْ إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. Right? Same terminology. And we selected them and guided them to صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ, to a straight path. Now look, after I believe it's 18 prophets and messengers, look at all these different prophets and messengers mentioned here, and he refers to them all as being guided to a straight path, صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. And then what he says next is very significant. He says, ذَلِكَ هُدَى اللَّهِ يَهْدِي بِهِ مَنْ يَشَاءُ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ. That is the guidance of Allah, that he guides therewith whoever he wills of his servants. And what do we say in Al-Fatiha? Ihdina as-Siraat al-Mustaqeem. Guide us to the straight path. He says, we guided all of these to Siraat al-Mustaqeem. ذَلِكَ هُدَى اللَّهِ. That is the guidance of Allah. Then he says, وَلَوْ أَشْرَكُوا لَحَبِطَ عَنْهُمْ مَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. And if they associated partners, all of what they did would have habita, like been dropped or futile. Then he says, أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحُكْمَ وَالنُّبُوَّةَ. Those are the ones that we gave the book, the judgment, and the prophethood. فَإِنْ يَكْفُرْ بِهَا هَؤُلَاءِ. So if these people do kufr in it, فَقَدْ وَكَّلْنَا بِهَا قَوْمًا لَيْسُوا بِهَا بِكَافِرِينَ. Then we have entrusted it to people who are not kafirin in it. Okay, now this is kind of the conclusion here in verse 90. He says, أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ هَدَى اللَّهِ. Those are the ones that Allah guided. فَبِهُدَاهُمْ اقْتَدِهِ. So follow their huda, model or pattern or follow yourself, pattern yourself or follow in their footsteps or follow their huda, iqtadi. Okay, so it's interesting that after all these prophets and messengers in the same chapter, where later, starting from verse 151, we read these different like universal human values that Allah ends each verse by saying ذَلِكُمْ وَصَّاكُمْ بِهِ, that he commands you. In the same chapter, in verses 83 to 90, he mentions all these prophets and messengers. And then at the end of that, he says, فَبِهُدَاهُمْ اِقْتَدِهِ. So follow their guidance. And what's really interesting too about this, another layer I think, is that the word for follow here is in the singular. فَبِهُدَاهُمْ, by their guidance, اِقْتَدِهِ, follow it. That's in the singular. So it's addressing a singular reader of the text, or a singular reciter or hearer of the text. So, of course, it's addressing each one of us as an individual. But who is the first individual that it would be addressing? Would be the Prophet Muhammad, right? Because that's who the Quran was revealed to. So initially, it's telling him, فَبِهُدَاهُمْ اِقْتَدِهِ. Follow their guidance. It's telling the Prophet, follow their guidance. So I think that's really interesting because a lot of times as Muslims, I think we get into kind of this thing of well, never mind. I'm not going to say that because I don't want to offend anyone. I was trying to choose my words carefully because different people have different. I think this is a good place for me to mention this because I was debating on how I wanted to address this. I think different people have different perceptions on what it means to follow the Sunnah or the way of the Prophet Muhammad, right? And that's natural because we're all different people and we all have different different perspectives and different things that we learn. So I think that's a normal and a natural thing. I think the problem sometimes comes about where people try to vilify others for not following the example of the Prophet Muhammad in the same way. And like people will say, if you like talk about the Quran and you emphasize the Quran, people will assume that means you don't follow the Sunnah of the Prophet. That's not necessarily the case. What is the Sunnah of the Prophet, right? That's a whole different discussion. So the reason what I was getting ready to say was I think why I think these verses are so beautiful is because I think there are certain people who elevate the Prophet above other prophets to an unjust like level, I think. And these verses are telling the Prophet himself, first and foremost, to follow their guidance. But that doesn't mean
I don't.
Go ahead.
I think we hold this. This is a very eerie thing to say, but I think we hold the Rasulullah Muhammad in too high of an esteem. Like Allah says, the duty of the Rasul is only in the conveyance of the message.
Yeah.
So beyond that, he's just a man.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that you're saying anything other than what the Quran says. The Quran says that. وَمَا مُحَمَّدٌ إِلَّا رَسُولٌ قَدْ خَلَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ الرُّسُلُ. Muhammad was nothing but a messenger. Many messengers have passed before him. أَفَإِنْ مَاتَ أَوْ قُتِلَ انْقَلَبْتُمْ عَلَىٰ أَعْقَابِكُمْ. If he dies or is killed, will you turn back upon your heels? So like he teaches us, don't just get caught up on him as a person. It's about the message. So no, I agree. I think the point go ahead.
I don't think we should be following him necessarily. We should be following the message. You get what I'm saying?
No, I'm in agreement with you. That's why I said, how do you define the Sunnah? Is the question. Different people have different explanations. The main point that I wanted to address, and the only reason I mentioned is because someone actually brought that to my attention. In our classes, we try to be very inclusive as much as we can. I mean, there's only so much you can do because some people will naturally just exclude themselves. That happens. You see that a lot happens in our lives. People, no matter what we're talking about, there's always going to be some people that are going to object. So you can't always do that. But to the degree that we can, we try to do that. So it was brought to my attention, and I think it's a valid issue that was raised that sometimes, because of the emphasis that we place on the Quran, which we should do. So they weren't saying we shouldn't do that, but they were saying sometimes that could cause certain people to kind of belittle people that are more, they want to study the Quran, but also they have a lot of interest in studying Hadith too, because people have different perspectives and different levels of interest in studying that field. I myself am a good example. That did sound weird. I myself am a good example. Whatever. I'm sleepy. It was a late night. In my early years of being Muslim, I put a lot of emphasis on wanting to study Hadith, and I learned a lot from that. But then at a certain point, I wanted to turn my attention to the Quran. So the point that was made was, because it's a Quran class where we try to be inviting to everyone, we should be careful of like alienating people by belittling people that follow hadith, right? Or follow. Yeah, and that's what happens. Unfortunately, I think it's unfortunate that that's what happens a lot of times when people uh, develop the mentality of being like kind of Quran only, right? Which I personally don't have a problem with that. So I'm not saying that's an issue. But I think what is an issue is then they become the mirror image of the people who are kind of like cultish in following hadith and stuff like that. Just how those people will like vilify people who don't follow what they follow and basically make them feel, belittle them, make them feel like they're not Muslims. Sometimes people who start to emphasize the Quran more will end up doing that back to people who follow hadith. And so really you end up just creating just another sect. And
yeah, you go on defense.
yeah, and I think that's what in our classes, I think that's what we try to avoid, right? Is we try to be welcoming to everyone. That doesn't mean we can't express our opinions. Just like you just expressed your opinion. It was very respectful. And you said how you looked at it, and that's fine, because if we can't do that, then that's another cult thing, if we're not allowed to express our opinions. But I think the expression of those opinions should be also in line with respecting what other people believe, because even the Quran tells us, even when it comes to people, and I'm not equating people, who emphasize more studying hadith, I'm not equating them with people who worship other than Allah. Don't take me the wrong way. But I'm just saying, even Allah tells us people who do that don't insult what they worship. He says, لا تسبوا الذين يدعون من دون الله فيسبوا الله عدوا بغير علم. Do not insult those that they worship besides Allah, lest they insult Allah wrongfully without right. So if that's the case with people who are worshiping other than Allah or calling upon other than Allah, then even more so I would say with people who are, our fellow Muslims and students in the journey of the Quran, we shouldn't insult their perspective, right? So I thought it was a valid point that was raised, and I'd never want to be the one that's responsible for giving that impression. So I thought this was a good, since I was referencing how this references the Prophet Muhammad, I thought that was a good little digression to address that point. And I'm not even saying anyone here, they really didn't, when they brought that up to me, they didn't say if it was in our live classes, if it was in Discord classes, and I didn't really ask where they got that impression, because it really doesn't matter. It's always a good reminder. So if none of us were people who did it, then alhamdulillah, then it don't apply to us personally, but it's a good reminder, to be careful, even for myself. Because sometimes, like, I'm kind of, you guys know I'm kind of silly. I like to joke around. So sometimes somebody might say something, and I might say something offhand, kind of silly, and it might be offensive. So I think it's definitely something to always keep in mind, to try our best to study the Quran together while respecting that we might not always have the same perspective on every single issue. And I think, and you guys probably already know this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I think you'll find that this is very unique. Like that approach to classes and learning is very unique, I think, because in all of the different classes,
100%.
Yeah, all the different classes I've been involved with, it's always you have to accept this particular perspective. It's very rare that you find a place where different perspectives are tolerated and allowed and even encouraged. So yeah, in line with this verse 690, when he tells the Prophet, فَبِهُدَاهُمْ اِقْتَدِي, I think that does give us a leveled and balanced approach to the Prophet Muhammad, that, we don't want to put him to such a degree. Like, I remember, just to give another example of what I'm trying to say, I remember I had a class one time, it was an in-person class, and I was talking about Jesus, and I was saying how Jesus in the Quran might be, I don't remember exactly how I phrased it, if I said perhaps, I tend to say that a lot, so I might have said it like that, perhaps might be one of the best examples of someone following As-Siraat Al-Mustaqeem, someone following the straight path. And why I said that, because, so this is actually a good transition, because we're talking about the straight path. Because in, I think it's 43, let me double check. Let's see here. Am I right about that? Is it 43? Yeah. So in 43:59, he says, in huwa illa, he's talking about Jesus. He says, in huwa illa abdun an'amna alayhi. He is only an abd, a servant, an'amna alayhi, which we bestowed an'amna alayhi, which we bestowed our blessings upon. Okay? But the reason I made that statement about Siraat Al-Mustaqeem and Jesus being one of the best examples for that, or maybe even the best example, I don't know, we would have to study that more. I'm talking about from a Quranic perspective, because he specifically mentions Jesus in particular. Because in Surah Al-Fatiha, we say, Ihdina Siraat Al-Mustaqeem, right? Siraat Al-Ladina An'amta Alayhim. The path of those that you an'amta alayhim, you bestowed your blessings upon. And how does he describe Jesus here? In huwa illa abdun an'amna alayhi. Right? So he's mentioned specifically as we bestowed our blessings upon him. And we're asking in Fatiha to be guided to the path of those you bestow your blessing. So at the very least, I would say that's a pretty strong argument that Jesus in the Quran is one of the best models of what is someone upon Siraat Al-Mustaqeem, because we're asking that. So in a class that I had, and I talked about that. And also, when you look in some of the verses that talk about Jesus, Jesus says things like, وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ رَبِّي وَرَبُّكُمْ فَاعْبُدُوا هَذَا صِرَاطٌ مُسْتَقِيمٌ. So he references Siraat Al-Mustaqeem. He says, and Allah is my Lord and your Lord, so do ibadah of him. This is this is Siratul Mustaqim. This is a straight path. So I remember after the class, this one brother came up to me and he said, I'm worried that we're not talking about the Prophet Muhammad enough. Like, he took it as a downplay of the Prophet Muhammad that I was emphasizing Jesus. But I
trying to protect Rasulullah.
Yeah, but I think that's what I guess that's what I'm trying to say when I talk about not having a balanced viewpoint of the Prophet Muhammad, because the name Muhammad is in the Quran 4 times. Jesus is in the Quran, if I remember correctly, like 25 times, right? So it's not me that put the emphasis, right? The Quran put the emphasis. The Quran gave us these beautiful stories about Jesus. For what purpose? To not talk about it. But I think that
that's a fair point.
Well, yeah. Go ahead. What did you say?
I don't know, the other day, because I just be taking screenshots of things that I find online of posts and stuff. I don't know if you guys know Yasmin Mograbhed, I think her name is.
Yeah, Yasmin Mujahid. Yeah, I'm familiar. Yeah.
I just realized that this post was from her, but it says, my teacher said something today that really struck me. The very first conversation in Revelation was the admission of I can't. When commanded to read, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, I can't read. And this is the most essential part of our journey. I, in asterisk, can't. So next he was told, read by the name of your Lord. By myself, I can do nothing. By God, I can do anything.
I like that.
So that gives emphasis on what you were saying about the Prophet Muhammad, and obviously his role as messenger is just that it's not necessarily, like you said, put him on a pedestal. Which, of course, he is the most, the best example for mankind, but that is just because of his, connection with Allah.
Right. No, for sure. That's a great point. I appreciate that. Thank you. For sure.
That's beautiful.
There's even a hadith where he said himself, I don't remember the exact wording, but he said, don't exaggerate in praising me as the Christians exaggerated in praising Jesus, the Son of Mary. So, this is a part of our deen too, that we want to stay balanced in that, right? And so I guess that's the example of Jesus is what I'm talking about. Is if you talk about other prophets and messengers, not always, but sometimes people will feel that, well, the emphasis should be more on the Prophet Muhammad, but it is because we're studying the Quran. He's the one who delivered the Quran to us. So I think within that though, I guess my main point of that too is we always want to be respectful and understanding of other people's perspectives. So hopefully that makes sense, inshallah. And continuing with this theme of Siraat al-Mustaqeem, and the idea of that it's a universal path. We're going to go to chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse... What verse is that? Oh, it's verse 69. So, what's interesting about this verse is, again, how does he describe those who follow the straight path, or the path that we're asking to be guided to? He says, Ihdina Siraat al-Mustaqeem, Siraat al-Ladina an'amta alayhim. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those upon whom you have bestowed your blessing. Right? So now, look at verse 69 of chapter 4. He says, وَمَنْ يُطِعِ اللَّهَ وَالرَّسُولَ فَأُولَٰئِكَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ أَنْعَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ. And whoever obeys Allah and the Messenger, then those are with مَعَ الَّذِينَ أَنْعَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ. They are with those who Allah has bestowed His blessing upon. Okay, so number one, we're asking, Ihdina Siraat al-Mustaqeem, Siraat al-Ladina an'amta alayhim, the path of those that you bestowed your blessing upon. And here he's going to tell us in a general way. So he told us specifically with Jesus that he bestowed his blessing upon him. But here in a general way, right, what does he tell us? He says, مَعَ الَّذِينَ أَنْعَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ مِنَ النَّبِيِّينَ وَالصِّدِّيقِينَ وَالشُّهَدَاءِ وَالصَّالِحِينَ, of the prophets and the truthful and the witnesses and the righteous. وَحَسُنَ أُولَٰئِكَ رَفِيقًا. And what great or what beautiful companions these are. So again, I think this supports this idea. When you put all these verses together, starting with 651, right, when he gives us these 10 things that are universal human values, and then he says, وَأَنَّ هَذَا صِرَاطِي مُسْتَقِيمًا. This is my straight path. And then when you go before that in the surah, when he talks about like 18 different prophets and messengers, and then he says, فَبِهُدَاهُمْ اِقْتَدِي, follow their guidance. And then when you go here, he says, whoever obeys Allah and his messenger, and the messenger, then they are with those who Allah bestowed his blessing upon. And then he lists all these different like groups of people, the prophets, the truthful, the witnesses, and the righteous. So I think the idea of As-Siraat al-Mustaqeem is a very broad and comprehensive idea. And I think, and actually, this kind of goes with the point that we were just talking about, because I think, therefore, it can accommodate many different groups of people and many different perspectives, because it's very broad. It's not so narrow as to have to exclude so many people, right? So people of varying perspectives can all be included in As-Siraat al-Mustaqeem, because it's more about the idea of universal human values than being restricted to, a particular perspective. And I think that that's one of the things that, to me, is kind of a tragedy, that, every group restricts As-Siraat al-Mustaqeem to their perspective. And I think that's kind of sad, because us as human beings, we're so limited in the knowledge that we have. We're so limited in our ability to see, and to comprehend, certain things, because we can only take in so much as human beings. We can only comprehend so much as human beings. So for us to think that because of what we have comprehended in our limited comprehension, that means that this is what the straight path is, and everything outside of it is excluded. I think that's to me, I think that's a misguided approach. In our study of the Quran, personally, I would never feel, and I would never say, like, there are people that, as we talked about, there are people that sometimes come up in the lives and stuff. They don't always agree with what we're talking about. But I personally wouldn't say, well, if you don't agree with this, you're not on Siraat al-Mustaqeem, or you're not a good Muslim, or whatever the case might be. So I think this way of thinking about As-Siraat al-Mustaqeem is a very beautiful, it's a very comprehensive, and it's a very open way of thinking about it. And in fact, I think it's also in Surah 6. Let me share this verse with you. It's interesting that all these verses are in Surah 6. The well, not that one, not 4, but these ones that I'm referencing now, right? He says in 6, 125 and 126, he says, فَمَنْ يُرِدِ اللَّهُ أَنْ يَهْدِيَهُ, whoever Allah intends to guide him, يَشْرَحْ صَدْرَهُ لِلْإِسْلَامِ, he opens his chest to Islam, right? وَمَنْ يُرِدَ أَنْ يُضِلَّهُ يَجْعَلْ صَدْرَهُ ضَيِّقًا حَرَجًا, he says, and whoever he wants to misguide him, he makes his chest constricted and narrow, كَأَنَّمَا يَصَّعَّدُ فِي السَّمَاءِ, as if he's ascending to the sky. كَذَلِكَ يَجْعَلُ اللَّهُ الرِّجْسَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ, likewise does Allah place filth upon those who don't have iman. And then he says, وَهَذَا صِرَاطُ رَبِّكَ مُسْتَقِيمًا, and this is the path of your Lord, mustaqima, straight or upright. So I think those verses are interesting too, because it talks about the guidance and it talks about the sirat mustaqim, but it talks about the openness. Yashrah sadrahu lil Islam, he opens, whereas the opposite of that is yaj'al sadrahu dayyiqan, just restricted. So I think the guidance contains like this mind-opening experience. It's not so exclusive and restricted that it closes us in and makes us just tight and restricted. And that's part of Sirat Mustaqim. And Allah knows best. So that's what I have for our class for the day. If there's any follow-ups or any questions or comments, then inshallah we can do that. If not, then we're good.
MashaAllah, thank you, brother. I got nothing for you.
What?
Oh, I just wanted to touch on the last live that we had. I don't know if you have time.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, because I was genuinely super interested in what you're talking about with the names of the angels, because honestly, I always liked the name Gabriel, and like, and then when you were talking about that it actually has like a root word and like the ending means something, and I was like, what? And then so I was doing research, and okay, so you said Jabr means strength or something like that, right? But then when I was doing my research, it was funny because I was on just regular Google. Normally I use like a private search engine, but I was just on regular Google because I was just out. And then every time I would look up, like what does Jibreel mean? It would give me like Hebrew or like something, something along the lines of whatever the agenda is, like that pays Google or whatever.
Yeah.
And so once I found something that says, it kind of said that the EL means some sort of like deity or some sort of, I guess, vessel, if you want to say that. And then how you were talking about too, how about Bani Israel and Bani Adam, and how those are the only two like times that it says people of some sort. And then you were making the connection of what Isra means, which is the night journey. So it's like the people of Israel are the people who are like journeying through the darkness, like trying to find the light, which is pretty much like a Muslim, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
that's I don't know if I have a question.
Oh no, I'm glad. No, I'm glad you recapped that. For sure. No, that's amazing. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because those are things that we want to explore more. Those are things I'm trying to currently research for our classes and for my own self. So like Jibreel, as you mentioned, the prefix Jabr, right? If we look in the Quran, so side point to help us with this. A lot of people, when they approach the Quran, when it comes to certain names like Jibreel or like Yunus or different names like that, a lot of people take the assumption that these are non-Arabic in origin, and so therefore they were Arabicized, and so they don't really have a meaning in Arabic. They have a meaning in whatever language they came from. Personally, I don't like that opinion, but I don't follow that opinion. The reason why is because I think it's better. I think that it kind of misses the point of the language of the Quran. So to me, it's not about like we can go to other languages to help us, right? To open our minds up. I don't think that's a problem. But I think we also have to distinguish between the Arabic language as a language and the language of the Quran. I don't think there's a lot of overlap, obviously, right? But I don't think those are exactly the same thing. So I think if we're talking about the Quran as being a divinely inspired book whose language choice is divinely inspired and based upon the utmost wisdom, then I don't think we should underestimate the fact that Allah can use names that are related to Arabic words to convey certain meanings, right? Even if originally that name was in another language. But that doesn't mean he can't use that. Like if I think in the last live I used an example of like Kendrick Lamar, right? So if we heard Kendrick Lamar using a lyric and in the lyric he referenced something from Hebrew, we wouldn't say, oh, that's just a Hebrew word. His song is in English, so that doesn't really have any meaning. No, we would say, yeah, it's Hebrew, but he used it to convey something. Like, what was he trying to say? And then we would take other parts of his song and put it together. We would try to find the context, and we would see like, oh, that was brilliant. See, I use this Hebrew word because it means this in Hebrew, but also in the song there's this word in English, and it relate. We would analyze it on that because we respect his intelligence, and we assume a person of that level of intelligence isn't just throwing things in there randomly to make them rhyme. That's what makes a really good rapper versus someone who's kind of corny. Someone who's kind of corny is just trying to make things rhyme, but someone who's really good can make it rhyme, but they can also make it have meaning. And so if we would think that about a human being, why wouldn't we assume that about the Quran? That, right, the ends of the verses rhyme, right? But it's not just to make them rhyme. They have meaning. The words, they could have origins in other languages originally, right? But the usage of them specifically in the Quran has meaning. That's the perspective I take. So when you start looking at names like Yunus, I would relate that to the verb anasa, which means to perceive something. Or Yusuf. Is it, for example, with Yusuf, right? Look at Yusuf's name. Yusuf. Is it a coincidence that Yusuf's name is spelled and pronounced like that? And in the story of Yusuf, Yaqub is quoted as saying, فَتَوَلَّ عَنْهُمْ, he turned away from them, وَقَالَ يَا أَسَفَ عَلَى يُوسُف. يَا أَسَفَ عَلَى يُوسُف. He says, oh, ya asafa, my grief, because asaf means grief, ala Yusuf, but asaf is like grief for something you lost. And he says, ya asafa ala Yusuf, right? As if Yusuf is like this source of grief from being lost, right? So someone could say, oh, well, that came from Hebrew. It doesn't mean that. Yeah, but look at how the Quran used it. Look at the unique language of the Quran. So that's the perspective I take. So Jibreel, I saw that to say like Jibreel, when you start thinking about Gabriel and you start looking at the etymology of it, could that have had different meanings in like Hebrew and stuff? Of course. But why is the Quranic word, why is Jibreel so closely related to like Jabr? And if you think about Jabr, I said power, but maybe a more accurate or meticulous way of thinking about that word Jabr. So they say Jabr in Arabic has two meanings basically. It means to force something, and it means also to fix. And so in Arabic, like for example, if you're talking about fixing a broken bone, we would use this word Jabr, right? So to me, the two meanings go together. Like, so it's not either or. Like sometimes people present those two meanings as like being either or, but I think they go together because I think Jabr has to do with fixing something by means of force, right? So just like when you fix a bone, you have to put it in a cast, and what the cast does is it immobilizes that limb. So it forces that limb or that bone to fix itself by immobilizing it, right? So that's why in the Quran, I think Allah tells us, وَمَا أَنْتَ عَلَيْهِمْ بِجَبَّارٍ. which often they translate that as you're not like a tyrant over them, but you're not jabbar, meaning, or at least how I take it, you're not someone over them that is supposed to force them to be fixed, to put them into situations where they're forced to fix themselves, because ultimately a person fixing themselves should be their choice. It shouldn't be a forcing thing. So you're not jabbar over them. But Allah talks about He is al-jabbar al-mutakabbir. He is al-jabbar. So He is someone that can create situations that fix you. Potentially is one way to think about it. And it's interesting too that this same word is the word that algebra is derived from. Al-jabr. Al-jabr. That's where algebra comes from. So how does that relate to the meaning? So I can think of two different ways that could relate from both meanings, forcing and fixing. So if you think about what algebra is, and I have a feeling like Hannah's in a minute going to say, oh man, he's making me do math now. Because I think when I mentioned this example...
I work in finance, you can make me do math, that's fine. But I did want to say, and with the whole thing on the name, so Yusuf, Yosef, Joseph, they all mean the same thing. It means to add.
Oh, okay.
So I'm just curious, because most names generally mean the same thing.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. There probably is a lot of commonality in meaning. But I think also we want to look at the specific Quranic usage of the meaning. So the other meanings that we might get from other... Go ahead.
But I am curious, even though you say that you don't go to the other languages, El is a creator. So maybe it could have been a website, because there is a lot of stuff online that contradicts or tries to frame it in a way that, oh, don't follow this because it means entity, or it means this, or it's, like the same as we have.
Yeah.
It will say some reference to a hadith and it'll be like, don't follow this because it's a twisted meaning. So I think we need to be careful of what dictionaries we're looking at.
No, I agree.
That's true. Thank
I
you.
agree. No, and let me correct, if I did say that, let me correct myself. I didn't intend to say that we don't look at the other languages. That's not what I meant, because I often will look at different things, like different languages. In fact, one of the books I'm reading right now as research for our class is this book, The History of the Jews. So no, I'm not saying don't look at that, but what I was addressing was this idea where people... Go ahead.
When the meaning changes, don't focus on it too much, basically.
Yeah, that and this idea that some people have where they'll say, like, when you relate names in the Quran to Arabic words. So if you relate Yusuf to Asaf or Jibril to Jabr, sometimes they'll argue against that and they'll say, like, no, that's from Hebrew, so it's not really an Arabic word, so you can't explain it by an Arabic word. So what I was saying is, like, no, you can use the Hebrew, but you can also use the Arabic, because don't underestimate the wisdom of the Quranic usage, right? That Allah could accomplish multiple different things at once, right? Like I actually saw a video. There was a video of the brother. I don't know if you guys ever watched the brother Abdul Kahar, but he did a video about a couple of names in the Quran. One of them was Yahya, and he referenced the verse in Surah Maryam where it says, Ya Yahya khudh al-kitaba biquwwa wa ataynahu al-hukma sabiyya wa hananan min ladunna. So it references Yahya and it says, oh Yahya, take the book with strength. And it says, and we gave him judgment as a young child. And then in the next verse it says, wa hananan, that we made him like compassionate, hananan. But the point he made is that, I don't remember it all the way exactly, but I thought it was an interesting point. It's something to this effect, though, that in Greek, the Greek translation of John is something like Yohanna or something like that, right? And he was saying how interesting it is that this is the only place in the Quran that uses the word Hanan, which sounds just like or very similar to the Greek translation of the word John, Yohanan, or however exactly you say that. And he referenced John, Yahya, then he said Hanan, right? So it's kind of like a nod to, or what we would
Yeah,
say.
we have it in Hebrew as well. Yohan
Yeah.
is the same word, John. Yohan.
Yeah, exactly. That's that. So the point that he was making in the video, and I thought this was a really interesting point, was that even though in the Quran we refer to John as Yahya, but right in the same context he referred to him as Hanan, compassionate, not as a name but as a description, and as if that was like a subtle like wink, like almost like the Quran is like winking at us, like I'm gonna tell you this a little secret I'm gonna slip in here for you, like don't tell nobody, like I'm gonna slip it right here, just you got to pay real close attention. So that's kind of, go ahead.
I'm just talk. Wait, sorry, I didn't know you were talking about.
No, go ahead, Caesar. I'm sorry.
Nothing. I just said something, but I thought that you thought that I was saying something to add, but I was just like talking to myself. Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. I talk to myself all the
time. Do you have time for one of the sisters has a question in the chat?
Yeah, please ask. I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on.
I know you can't see
with my chat capabilities today. I don't know what's happening.
Right.
But what's the question?
The sister Rose said, I have a question about Surah Al-Imran 191 to 194. Is that referring to prayer? It's the only question that's been asked in the chat. So
191.
Yeah.
I wouldn't. Allah knows best. Let me say that first. I wouldn't say it's just referring to prayer. I would say it could refer, like it could cover prayer. So let me read it and I'll explain why. So the verse says, it says, الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ. Those who remember Allah standing and sitting and lying on their sides. So I would say, yes, that could include prayer. But I think the fact that it mentions remembering, dhikr, we shouldn't just limit it to that, right? Because again, if we're talking about respecting the Quranic wording, so that's something that we always want to try to do, is we don't want to just assume when we have one word that it's equivalent to the other word, even though they might overlap. So when it comes to salah, the salah is mentioned as saying, aqim as-salata li dhikri, establish salah for my remembrance, right? So definitely salah has something to do with dhikr, but also the Quran has something to do with dhikr, right? The Quran says, wal Qur'ani dhi dhikr. The Quran contains dhikr. Aw yuhdithu lahum dhikra, about the Quran, that it might bring up a dhikr. So the idea of dhikr, again, is one of those terms that's very comprehensive and it could include a lot of different things. So in my opinion, and Allah knows best, I would say that this verse is referring to any kind of remembrance of Allah, standing, sitting, and upon your sides. And Allah knows best. Hopefully.
Is it a coincidence then, and I'm reading from the chat, is it a coincidence that the word Rabb or Rabbana is mentioned 5 times in these verses, and we say Rabb in every single prayer?
Yeah, I don't know. I never noticed that. I have to think about that. Let's see.
Okay.
191, Rabbana, 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 Rabbana. I think it's 6 times though. Let me see. So 191 is Rabbana ma khalaqta hadha batilan. 192 is Rabbana innaka man tudkhil an-nar. That's the 2nd time. 193 is Rabbana innana sami'na munadiyan. That's the 3rd time. The 4th time is in the same verse in 193. Rabbana. No, it is 5. Yep. 194 is Rabbana. Yeah, I don't know. Allah knows best. That's a good. I don't think it's a coincidence. Let me say that. I don't think anything in the Quran is a coincidence. However, what's the meaning of it? That's the question. That's a good observation. Yeah, that's a good observation. So I will say I don't know. I never thought about it because I never noticed that before. That's a really good observation.
She stumped you.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say she stumped me. I would say she inspired me, because any observations like that about the Quran are always beautiful, because nothing is a coincidence in the Quran. So it fuels contemplation. It makes you think like, oh wow, here's something new that I never thought about.
Rama said bars.
Is there anything else?
Not for me. I'll just let you know. It doesn't look like anybody has
Nothing
anything
for
else.
me, but I will be at a wedding, so in your normal live, I won't be as present in the chat, but I'll still be hanging around.
Okay, I appreciate it.
I hope you have a
Alhamdulillah.
good time.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. I'll see you guys at 2, inshallah, for those who can make it.
Thank you, Ben.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you guys, man. I appreciate it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum.